Brett, good to see you. Part one of your three-part series on the Delgamuukw decision was published today. Why did you decide to take a deep dive into the Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan's long fight for rights and title?
Well, I really began chipping away at this story once this whole story broke. We often heard about the Delgamuukw case, and we heard the hereditary chiefs cite that Supreme Court decision in support of their claim that they are the rightful stewards and title holders of the land. So I started looking into that, and what I did was I called many of the people who were involved in that case, the lawyers. I talked to the anthropologists who spent years in the 80s among the Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan preparing reports. And what I soon realized was that I had found a much larger story, a really humanizing story that I couldn't really contain in one article. And so I talked to a lot of fascinating people, a lot of hereditary chiefs. I spoke to Chief Yagalal, who sat through every single day of that court case in BC Supreme Court that was spread out over 4 years. And she shared her story with APTN News.
Brett, in light of the RCMP raids of Wet'suwet'en land defenders and allies and the ongoing protests, rail blockades, many are wondering who the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are and how to make sense of the claims by some that the chiefs are illegitimate. How do you explain the situation?
Well, it's tough to explain, certainly. The one thing you do have to remember about the Wet'suwet'en governance system is that it's a pre-colonial governance institution, and you have to remember that the Indian Act actually made feasts illegal in the 1800s, and so it was really subject to a lot of colonial persecution. But the key is that what happens in the feast halls are the laws, according to Wet'suwet'en tradition. So it's very difficult to say whether a title was stripped rightfully or whether it was attributed to someone rightfully under Wet'suwet'en law, unless you have access to those feasts. But the key to remember is that Wet'suwet'en culture is very different from Western culture. It's even different from Anishinaabeg culture or Haudenosaunee culture here in the East. Colonization really didn't begin in full force in Wet'suwet'en territory until the early 1800s. And it began by oppressing that governance institution. So you have to remember that they've been fighting for a long time to have that system recognized. And the Delgamuukw court case was just one major milestone in that struggle.
National media focused on the impacts of the blockades, more so than on the violation of Wet'suwet'en rights and Indigenous rights. What, if anything, has been missing from the public discourse around the conflict?
Context, Dennis. I would say context has been the main thing missing, not just recent context, but I'm talking about historical context that we really haven't seen. So placing these blockades within the historical continuum of colonialism and blockades that have happened in the past. So I talked to Satsan Herb George. He's a wing chief in the Birch Bark House, and he told me about blockades in the 70s and 80s that they had done against logging, clear cutting, and hydroelectric dams that sound very similar to what's going on today. And so we've been really missing that in the coverage that we're seeing. And not only that, going back, as I said, to colonialism, not a lot of people know that it was illegal for Indians, quote unquote, under the Indian Act to fish commercially in BC for many years. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to have feasts. And they've been resisting that throughout this entire time. And so Delgamuukw, and even right down to today, the fact that Delgamuukw went unresolved for all these years, 23 years, just is the important context that we've been missing. And that's what I'm trying to provide with this three-part story.
Part one's on the website now. What can we expect for parts 2 and 3?
Well, part one gives that background. Part two is somewhat of a courtroom drama, I suppose. It takes us right to the court case where the hereditary chiefs, back then the elders, some of them were born in the 1890s and they were 80 years old when this thing began in Smithers in 1987. And they were telling their oral histories in Wet'suwet'en, and they had accredited interpreters who were translating in real time to the Canadian and provincial lawyers, and so they lost big time in BC court. And there were tears shed, a lot of sadness, a lot of despair after that. And that's where Part 2 ends. But Part 3 restarts. They appealed. They made it to the Supreme Court, and they won. They won a pretty big decision there, but there was an asterisk. And what happened there was they ordered a new trial back in BC because the provincial Chief Justice had mishandled the oral testimony. He discredited it. He called it hearsay. So they ordered a new trial, and this new trial never happened because what the Supreme Court recommended was they negotiate. They negotiate a treaty. They negotiate some sort of agreement. And that never happened. And so what we're seeing now is these issues that have been outstanding, these negotiations that never went anywhere, are happening now in response to this nationwide solidarity blockade movement.
Well, Brett, appreciated Part 1. It was a real history lesson. Looking forward to Part 2s and 3.
Thanks, Dennis.